Imagine being an American citizen on U.S. soil, but not being able to have any say about what goes on in the nation. In fact, you can't even vote in the general election. This is not a hypothetical, but the reality for millions of forgotten Americans. RT's Roselle Reyes brings us the story.
Nationwide, people are already getting their votes in for the presidential election. But there are millions of Americans that will not be able to cast their ballot for the next commander-in-chief. Those Americans live hundreds of miles away from the mainland and are often forgotten, the U.S. territories. One way those Americans will be able to vote is if they move to the mainland like I did. In my 29 years, this will be the first time I, a former resident of Guam, will be able to vote. There are more than 4 million people living in the U.S. territories of Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. Most are U.S. citizens but don't have much power when it comes to national affairs. The territories show up at the Democratic and Republican national conventions to support.
Half a day.
But they can't actually vote in the general election. So how do they participate or have some sort of voice? Each territory has one representative in Congress, where again, they can't vote on bills because they're non-voting members, can only debate and serve on committees.
These citizens who have contributed and sacrificed so much still cannot vote for their commander-in-chief. This inability to vote has a direct correlation to the poverty and disenfranchisement in so many areas that the people of these island territories experience.
Let's head to Guam, where America's Day begins. Located in the western Pacific Ocean, Guam is the largest and most populous of the Mariana Islands. The island is the closest you can get to Asia and still be in American soil.
There is nothing not to love about Guam. It is a beautiful island in a strategically important location for the U.S. military, so much so their bases currently occupy over a quarter of Guam's land. And yet, the residents of Guam have absolutely no say in general elections for their commander-in-chief, which is even harder to swallow when you consider this.
According to Guam's Office of Veterans Affairs, at least 1 in 8 adult Guamanians is a veteran, among the highest percentages of all U.S. states and territories.
That's right. Guam gives a quarter of its land to the military, with an Air Force base up north and a naval base down south. Plus, Guam has the highest enlistment levels in the U.S. military. Yet, these Americans still can't vote. Even after years of opposition from the local community, the Pentagon's plan for a military buildup in Guam is still moving forward. Part of that plan is the relocation of thousands of U.S. Marines from Japan to Guam, additional training sites with some on sacred land, as well as sonar and weapons testing. Some consider this modern-day colonialism, yet nothing is still being done for the U.S. territories. Reporting for RT, Roselle Reyes.
And for more on this, I spoke with Professor of Communication at the University of Colorado Boulder, Dr. Tiara Na'puti. Here's our discussion. Dr. Na'puti, thank you so much for joining us today. As the elections draw near, you gotta wonder why it is that U.S. citizens who live on these islands, which are formally U.S. territories, why aren't they allowed to vote?
Well, thanks for having me today. I think the big issue that we have to remember is the U.S. is continuing colonial control through their national policies on the island. So this is a long history that we could go into maybe some other time, but part of it is that it's a history that started with Spanish colonial rule and has been continued through the United States and even the Japanese Empire. Not being allowed to vote is really tricky because the U.S. Supreme Court cases, the insular cases, actually determined that places like territories would be part of this doctrine of incorporation, giving a sort of flexible status for when the U.S. Constitution would be applied to the peoples. And that applicability of the Constitution kind of being applied to the territories has been continued since those cases were decided in the early 1900s. So really what we see is that the U.S. has always made decisions about the places like Guam, like Guahan, and in those cases, they actually determined part of the reason why voting rights wouldn't be provided is because they considered the peoples to be alien races. So it was really a racist and colonial doctrine, kind of a double whammy that meant that people in the territories were just not given the right to vote. And even when they were made U.S. citizens, that was a decision again made by the U.S. Congress without consent of the peoples. So we've really just seen over and over again that these territories are not given full protection under the law or even asked if they want to be protected by the United States in the first place.
Now, can we get a sort of a very brief summary, for example, of the history of Guam, and obviously an island in the South Pacific, which was a very important geopolitical strategic location for American troops during World War II. How do the locals and the natives feel about this kind of limbo citizenship status? And why do so many Guamanians and native Chamorros serve in the military?
Yeah, I think the history is really important. Actually, we're coming up on the 500-year anniversary of Ferdinand Magellan first arriving on the shores of Guam or Guam. And the moment that sort of really begins a colonial occupation that continues to this day. So, you know, I'm not going to give you the 500-year history, but kind of fast forwarding to 1898, that's when a lot of people recognize that the United States and Spain had the Spanish-American War. Those governments determined on their own, U.S. and Spain, that Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and these other places would become part of the United States. And so that history is important because it connects to your question about the service in the military. The U.S. actually, after acquiring Guam in the Spanish-American War, instituted a naval government. And that naval government continued until the U.S. Decided to allow a civilian government and give the citizenship status to Chamorros and the other local inhabitants. And so really, we have a long history of military service in part because of these grand narratives from World War II. You even mentioned it, like this idea of a geostrategic place that's important to the United States in World War II. Our island is, of course, so much more than that, but it's been used over and over again kind of as a stepping stone or a pawn for other countries to make their wars, to make their strategic security decisions. And over again, we see the community, the local community, even kind of buying into that service of the military. My family is one of those experiences of a long line of U.S. military service, but then again, not having the right, not having the opportunity, or not having the representation when it comes to the decisions that the military makes on our island, right? Yeah. So I think that's another issue that really has to be brought into the history, is that there's actually a long history, and it's still continuing today, not just of colonialism, but also of opposition to those lack of self-determination, right? The lack of abilities for people to actually say what they want for the population, for the political future. I think one of the biggest cases for decolonization is just that if you think about, say, the American context, it doesn't make sense to have an America based on these principles of, of freedom and democracy, and to not have those extend to all peoples, and especially to not allow freedom of choice for peoples who may not want to choose the United States. And the other part that I'll say is that demilitarization goes hand in hand with decolonization, because the U.S. military is the largest polluting entity on the planet. It has made a lot of decisions without consent of the people. It's poisoning our waters and our air and our land, and really is causing desecration. There's an ongoing massive military buildup that's happening right now in the islands of Guam and throughout the archipelago of the Mariana Islands. And these are decisions that were made in part because of that flexible constitutional status that I mentioned before, the ability of the U.S. government and the commander-in-chief that the people can't vote for to then have to deal with the everyday reality of militarization without representation is really an injustice that all voters and all people should be paying attention to.
Yeah, wow. I think all the information you just gave us the last few minutes is going to shock a lot of people that didn't realize that this actually happens to U.S. citizens. Fascinating, brief touch on history there. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Dr. Tiara Na'puti.